Hi, everybody. This is the fourth video in this short series on research methods in psychology. And in this video, we're going to talk about the case study. And the case study is a type of research that we do when we can't get a whole group of people. Typically, it's when we study things that are illnesses or injuries. And we'll get to that. So it's one case or a small group of unique cases. So some of the drawbacks of the case study method is that you can't generalize to the broader population from one study or from a really small sample size. So, for example, let's say I worked with a young girl. I was a one-on-one, so I was somebody who accompanied her for 3 hours a day. Just me and her. She had autism, and she was 6 years old, and she was a lovely little girl she was really cute. That's why I'm smiling. And she was also really disabled by her autism. So I'll tell you a few things about her. Her name was Autumn, and she could play 3 notes on the piano for hours, literally. Bum, 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 bum. Yeah, on and on and on. Or she could take a plastic bottle, like an empty water bottle, and hold it up to the light and crackle it and watch the light fracture on it. And she could do that for hours. So she was also nonverbal. And but one of the things about Autumn was that you could get her to change her behavior if you offered her a hamburger. She really loved these little beef patties. This was at a small group home. And she really loved these beef patties that they would leave for her in the fridge. Plain, kind of, to me, they were gross as a vegetarian, these little gray beef patties. She loved them. So you could say to her, "Hey, Autumn, could you please stop playing the piano? If you do, I have a burger here for you." And she would stop. So just that amount of information. If I were to ask you, do all children with autism love hamburgers? What would you say? Now, you know something about autism probably, and you would probably say no, but I would say, how do you know from just what I told you? Just what I told you. Nothing else. Would you know if her love of hamburgers had to do with autism or her own personal preferences? What if I asked you if children with autism like to do repetitive behaviors? From what I just shared with you, would you know? And the answer again is no. You would have to have a large group of children with autism and see what they had in common and start developing this idea of what autism is. And then you would know what is unique to this child and what is specific to autism. I hope that makes sense. So, of course, Autumn loved hamburgers, and that was her own personal characteristic, right? The other behaviors do have to do with autism, but I couldn't know that from this case study. So I can't generalize to the broader population from this little piece from this one person, right? Also, remember how I said that Autumn was cute? It's probably, I had fallen in love with this little girl. I spent 3 hours a day with her for months. And so, of course, I had affection for her and I cared about her. As a researcher, you could say that I was biased. So if I'm writing a case report, that might appear in my notes, in my report, my bias, my affection. I would argue that that bias can also be good, because it can create behaviors in me that are meaningful. So I start learning, because in a case study, you get a lot of depth. And we'll talk about that in the pros. I spent a lot of time with this little girl, and I learned a lot about what it's like for her parents, the bus driver who picked her up and took her to the day program that she was in, the counselors who worked with her. I learned a lot about her life and some of the things that children with autism and people who work with them run into. So maybe this would make me advocate for, I don't know, more one-on-one time than 3 hours a day. Programs that assist parents with getting to know their children better. I don't know. But I know more about the daily life. I'm not just a researcher looking at 1,000 kids with autism. Does that make sense? So, bias in general in research is bad. Let me just say that. But I think that there might be value sometimes with a case study, getting to know a client and getting close to them has its value. I'll just leave it with that. And let's look at the pros of the case study. So like I said, here we have depth, which is what I was just saying. You really get to know about a person and their behaviors and their needs and their treatment, right? The other thing is you can study events that you couldn't bring upon or do to a person. And what I mean by that is I couldn't do something that might give a child autism, for example, if I wanted to study autism. So, your textbook talks about Phineas Gage. They always talk about Phineas Gage. And he was a railroad worker in the early 20th century. And long story short, there was an accident and there was an explosion at the railroad tracks when they were working on them. And a pipe that he was holding that was also sharpened on its edge at one end from the explosion flew through his skull, and it damaged his I think it was his left eye and the left frontal lobe and the left temporal lobe. It literally came out the side. So it went in the front and came out the side. And he continued while injured, he actually continued to be able to walk and talk. And they took him to the hospital. And of course, he had the post removed from his head. And despite getting an infection and recovering, he lived. B, he was able to continue to walk and talk. So, what could we conclude from this? A few things. We can conclude that maybe even with severe damage to the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, a person can continue to walk and talk. Now, there's always a chance that Phineas Gage had a strange, unusual brain. That's one possibility. Probably not. Or we could conclude that those areas are not necessary for walking and talking. Now, we can't be 100% sure because, again, maybe he had a strange brain. But if you had a collection of people who were willing to be studied, who had similar injuries, you could start coming to conclusions about those areas of the brain, right? We also know that his personality changed after the injury. He had poor impulse control, had a hard time planning ahead, and had some anger issues. We might wonder if that had something to do with those areas of the brain. It could also have to do with the trauma of having, that kind of an accident. We don't know. But you couldn't study the frontal lobe and the temporal lobes by asking somebody for permission to remove them and seeing what happens. You see what I'm saying? So we can study unique things like diseases and injuries and come to conclusions about them, but we couldn't bring these things upon people. We couldn't do this to people. So that's one of the really great values of the case study. Okay, I'm going to end this video on case studies here.